Standards keep raising, and the path keeps shrinking. In this video, we're talking about humility, and how humility is the inverse of presence. Now, before you click away, remember, almost every spiritual concept which is universally deemed correct should be flipped around if we are to truly reclaim all parts of ourselves. After all, the virtues we were told would lead to enlightenment have obviously not worked, and the teaching of humility is no exception. So, we'll be talking about humility. What a great thing, right? Humility is almost always spoken of as a wise quality of masters and of sages, but I'm making the claim that humility is truly akin to diminishment, and that's not my judgment, it's in the definition. Humility comes from the Latin word humilus, which literally means low. If you feel humility in front of someone, you feel small in the scheme of things. This is why we have this word humiliation. But humility is seen as a virtue, right? Being humble. Someone who spends his life taking care of others shows humility. And dictionary definitions accentuate humility as a low self-regard and a sense of unworthiness. And in a religious context, humility means a recognition of self in relation to a deity, and therefore a self-debasement and subsequent submission to this said deity. And thus is the issue with this principle of be humble, right? Internalize humility that most accept. Humility is the inverse of presence because it stems from a belief that the self is to be distanced from or, watered down. But on this channel, we take the opposite approach. We talk about individuation, strengthening the self. We've spoken quite intently about the self and its strengthening, and how this doesn't necessarily lead to oppression. Like, we've had this idea that to strengthen the self has been to strengthen the ego. And this is destructive, right? Let us be humble and diminish ourselves. No, that's not what I align with. One can absolutely recognize their gifts, strengths, and talents while maintaining harmony. And this is one peril of this idea of be humble. It wishes to claim that the enlightened individual is to step away from themselves. And this is why being humbled can be defined as being unselved. But you are yourself. Inner alchemy states that gold is achieved when one has gone through a transmutative process to integrate all aspects of themselves. And the product is not an attitude of diminishment, but confidence, right? Of beauty, of wisdom, of presence. Oh yes, the gods and goddesses have a strong presence. And that's not to say overbearing or destructive. Now, let's not confuse ourselves. It's definitely necessary to admit our own imbalances, flaws, and thus be able to assess and integrate our limitations. I'm not saying we should be overconfident, especially when we know how we operate. Through inner alchemy, however, we're able to narrow our limitation because we're being mindful about every piece of ourselves, resulting in, presence. To say something like, I'm simply a piece of the human puzzle, sounds great and humble, but it is the easy road to simply blend in with anything. into a religious group, into a culture, into a belief system. But imagine this: we can coexist within the oneness of the all and within a strong sense of self simultaneously. It's not one or the other. We can coexist within the oneness of the all and within a strong sense of self. Thus is the dual nature of something like humility versus pride. You want to know what type of system arises when we confuse our own power with a destructive force? We're living in it. The energy extraction matrix all around us. It's built on submission, stemming from, yes, humility, diminishment of one's own powers and gifts. Now, of course, there are personas in place which have aimed to create division, in what we would call narcissists or sociopaths. But this type of personality is an extreme in the other direction. A persona like a narcissistic attitude actually represents an inner deficit, and thus an artificial strong presence is generated with a master-slave split. And this seems to be what many think of when we're speaking of having a strong ego or a strong sense of confidence. The ego represents your sense of self. This is the Jungian term of the ego. And your sense of self is absolutely important because what arises should be dealt with as a miniature representation of the universe. What many speak of when they say the word ego is actually the persona, a false self which is destructive. And it's become all too common to confuse humility with godliness, because integration always leads to presence, a presence which is, of course, confident, but also understands that creation is to be harmonized with. A strong sense of self without harm. That is the true ego. I read a few days ago that ego is the agent in you that always votes against change. Something like that. And we've all heard of such statements. But the true definition of ego is the part of yourself which mediates between the conscious and the unconscious and is responsible for testing reality and for a sense of personal identity. So the ego is not to be ignored, just like no aspect of yourself is to be ignored. The ego actually aids us in transmuting the dark into the light, the conscious and subconscious into the conscious. And in this way, the ego, which is really the sense of self, doesn't vote against change. It advocates change through realizing its capacity to harmonize with itself. Unlock yourself. Don't denigrate yourself. Is it any wonder why, in this spiritual conversation, many have thought of enlightenment as equivalent to the dissolving of the self? But what are we left with then? After all, you are the infinite in a finite container, and you are yourself, right here, right now, in this moment. I say, strengthen all aspects of you in full authenticity, and then no part of yourself will feel scary or as if you must remove a part of your being. We're not removing any part of ourselves to rise up. We're merging it all and realizing the parasitic aspects of ourselves. And these aspects have simply been important pieces that were misaligned. And this is why the spiritual archetypes of the monk, of the nun, of the wise man who speaks softly are incomplete. There's much wisdom to be gained through these archetypes, but the divine is not simply gentle, The divine can be powerful, exciting, strong as a gust, meek as a whisper, and outrageous as a god darn potent song and dance. We can't box in what defines the divine. And when we do this, then we enter the territory of emulation. The divine is itself and shall always play itself out in numerous forms. After all, the living souls are multidimensional beings, multifaceted. Hence, what you think I am not, and I shall consistently prove to you that I am not that box which you place me in. How glorious! It's never this or that. Much of this talk of humility really stems from the externalization of the divine. Because if there is an all-powerful deity who is objectively more powerful than you, who is judging you, or maybe punishing you, then the only answer is to be on your knees, right? And because we've externalized the divine, we've felt insignificant in comparison to the cosmos. But what if you are the cosmos? And you are. Well, then humility flips around and becomes presence. And again, one can be confident without being unreceptive, right? One can inhabit a strong sense of self and be absolutely receptive to newness, to change, to transfiguration, because the true self, not the false self, is addicted, I would say, to full authenticity, and where each breadcrumb leads it. You lead yourself further into yourself through this process. Keep up the great work.